The pre-dawn darkness still clung to New York City when Captain Jessica Morgan arrived at JFK International Airport. Her polished black shoes clicked against the terminal floor with military precision, a habit from her Air Force days she'd never quite shaken. At 41, she'd logged over 12,000 flight hours, survived 2 combat deployments flying C-17s in Afghanistan, and raised 2 kids as a single mother. Nothing rattled her anymore, or so she told herself. But this morning was different. Jessica couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt wrong as she walked through the crew entrance, her rolling suitcase trailing behind her. Maybe it was the way her 8-year-old daughter Emma had clung to her during their goodbye, small fingers gripping Jessica's uniform sleeve. "Promise you'll come back, Mommy," Emma had whispered, her voice carrying an unusual weight. Jessica had laughed it off, kissed her forehead, and promised like she always did. But the moment lingered, sticky and uncomfortable, like a shadow she couldn't shake. The operations room buzzed with the typical morning chaos, pilots checking weather reports, flight attendants reviewing safety procedures, ground crew coordinating logistics. Jessica grabbed her flight paperwork for United Flight 447, New York JFK to Los Angeles LAX, a Boeing 777-300ER, one of the most reliable aircraft in the sky. Routine cross-country flight. 5 hours and 20 minutes of cruising at 35,000 feet. She'd flown this route 73 times. Morning, Captain Morgan. First Officer David Chen appeared beside her, coffee in hand and his perpetual easy smile in place. At 32, David was sharp, competent, and had been her co-pilot for 6 months. They worked well together. He respected her experience, and she appreciated his meticulous attention to detail. "Morning, David," Jessica replied, scanning the weather report. Clear skies across the entire route, perfect flying conditions. "You okay?" David asked, his smile fading slightly. "You seem, I don't know, tense." Jessica forced her shoulders to relax. "Just didn't sleep well. My daughter had a nightmare." It wasn't entirely a lie. Emma had woken up at 2 a.m. crying about planes falling from the sky. Jessica had held her, stroked her hair, whispered reassurances until the little girl fell back asleep. Just a bad dream. Kids had them all the time. It meant nothing. So why couldn't she stop thinking about it? They made their way to the aircraft, the massive Boeing 777 gleaming under the terminal lights. Jessica loved this moment, the quiet before passengers boarded, when the aircraft was just a machine waiting to be commanded. She stepped into the cockpit, the familiar smell of leather and electronics greeting her. Home. The pre-flight checks began. Jessica's hands moved across the overhead panel with practiced efficiency. Fuel pumps, hydraulics, electrical systems, pressurization. Everything normal, everything perfect. David worked through his checklist on the right seat, calling out readings. Fuel load, 127,000 pounds. Hydraulic pressure, green across the board. Flight controls, checked and free. But Jessica checked again, then a third time. "Jess," David's voice held a note of concern. "That's the third time you've verified hydraulics. They're fine." "I know," she said quietly, her fingers lingering on the gauges. "Just humor me today, okay?" David didn't argue. He'd learned that when Captain Morgan had a feeling about something, you paid attention. Passengers began boarding, 342 souls filing into the cabin. Jessica watched them on the security camera, businessmen in suits typing on laptops, families with excited children heading to Disneyland, elderly couples holding hands, a young woman with headphones lost in her music. Each one a life, a story, a future. Each one trusting her completely to deliver them safely across the continent. The weight of that trust never got lighter, no matter how many flights she commanded. At 9:47 a.m., Flight 447 pushed back from the gate. Jessica's hands wrapped around the throttle levers, feeling the barely perceptible vibration of 3 massive engines spooling up. The 777 rumbled down the taxiway, and she ran through the final checks one more time. "Getting a little obsessive there, Captain," David teased gently. Old habit, Jessica replied, but her jaw was tight. Tower cleared them for takeoff on runway 31L. Jessica advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling 660,000 pounds of aircraft accelerate down the concrete. The speed built 80 knots, 100, 120. V1, David called, the point of no return. Rotate. Jessica pulled back gently on the yoke, and the Boeing's nose lifted gracefully into the morning sky. New York City spread below them like a glittering carpet. The morning sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of morning that reminded her why she loved flying. They climbed through 10,000 feet, then 20,000. The autopilot engaged with a soft click. Jessica's shoulders finally began to relax. See, nothing wrong, just nerves. Just Emma's nightmare getting into her head. At 35,000 feet, they leveled off over Pennsylvania. The cockpit settled into the gentle hum of cruise flight. David pulled out his tablet to review the fuel calculations. Jessica gazed out at the endless blue sky, watching a contrail from another aircraft miles above them. You know what? David said, breaking the comfortable silence. My wife's pregnant, just found out yesterday. Jessica turned to him, a genuine smile breaking through her tension. David, that's wonderful. Congratulations. Thanks, I'm terrified, he laughed. Any parenting advice from a pro? Yeah, cherish every morning goodbye like it's your last. The words came out before she could stop them, tinged with an intensity that made David glance at her sharply. She tried to soften it with a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. That got dark, David said carefully. Sorry, sleep deprivation. Jessica checked her watch, 11:29 a.m. They'd been airborne for 97 minutes. Los Angeles was 3 hours and 43 minutes away. Routine flight, perfect conditions, absolutely nothing. Her eyes drifted to the engine instruments, and her breath caught. A tiny fluctuation in the number 2 engine's vibration sensor. Barely noticeable, probably nothing, but her hand moved to the display anyway, pulling up detailed readings. See something? David asked. No, Jessica said slowly, it's probably nothing. But her fingers drummed against the throttle, and that whisper of intuition, the same one that had saved her life in Afghanistan when she'd aborted a landing seconds before ground fire erupted, screamed that something was very, very wrong. 18 minutes, that's all she had left. 18 minutes before everything she knew about flying, about survival, about the limits of human capability, would be tested in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Outside the cockpit window, the sky remained perfectly, beautifully, deceptively calm. 11:47 a.m. The moment etched forever in Jessica Morgan's memory. The explosion didn't sound like the movies. No dramatic fireball, no orchestral boom. It was a brutal, metallic crack followed by a shriek of tearing metal that rattled through the airframe like the scream of a dying animal. The Boeing 777 lurched violently to the right, and Jessica's body slammed against her harness so hard the breath punched from her lungs. For a split second, time froze. Her brain cataloged everything simultaneously. The cockpit tilting at an impossible angle, David's coffee cup suspended in midair before slantering against the windscreen, the master caution alarm erupting in an ear-splitting wail, and behind them, God behind them, the sound of 342 people screaming in terror. Engine failure, David shouted, but Jessica's hands were already moving. Years of muscle memory overrode conscious thought. Her left hand yanked the number 2 engine fire handle while her right fought the yoke, trying to level the aircraft that wanted nothing more than to roll inverted and plummet from the sky. The control wheel felt wrong, sluggish, heavy, like trying to steer a car through mud. Fire, fire in number 2. The automated warning system screamed at them. Jessica's eyes snapped to the engine instruments and her heart turned to ice. Engine number 2, The massive turbofan mounted on the right wing showed catastrophic failure, but it was worse than just a failed engine. Much worse. Red hydraulic warnings blazed across 3 separate systems. The fuel flow indicators for the right wing were plummeting, and the cabin pressure, Jesus Christ, the cabin pressure was dropping like a stone. "MASKS, oxygen MASKS," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision that surprised even her. The rubber mask dropped from the overhead panel. Jessica yanked it over her face with one hand while the other never left the controls. Beside her, David struggled with his mask, his hands shaking violently. She'd never seen fear in his eyes before. She saw it now. Through the windscreen, she caught a glimpse of the right wing and her stomach dropped. Fuel was streaming from the wing in a silvery vapor trail, atomizing in the 500-mile-per-hour slipstream. Worse, far worse. She could see a jagged hole in the engine cowling where shrapnel had punched through. The engine had suffered an uncontained failure, meaning the exploding turbine blades hadn't been stopped by the protective casing. They'd ripped through it like bullets through paper. "United 447, New York Center, say status." The air traffic controller's voice crackled urgently through her headset. Jessica keyed the mic, forcing her voice to remain steady despite her racing heart. "New York Center, United 447 declaring emergency. Catastrophic engine failure, suspected uncontained. We've lost primary hydraulics, we're losing fuel, and we have cabin decompression. Requesting immediate." The aircraft dropped. Not a gentle descent. A sickening, stomach-lurching plunge as the right wing, now bleeding fuel and lift, tried to drag them into a death spiral. Warning bells and klaxons created a symphony of disaster. The stick shaker activated, rattling the yoke violently in Jessica's hands, warning of an impending stall. bank angle," the automated voice shouted. Jessica hauled on the yoke with both hands, her shoulder muscles screaming in protest. The 777 weighed 500,000 pounds right now, and without hydraulic assistance, she was essentially trying to muscle fly a machine the size of a small building. Her arms trembled with the effort. "David, I need full left aileron now." David's hands joined hers on the controls, both of them pulling with everything they had. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the aircraft began to level, but Jessica could feel it in the controls. They were flying on borrowed time. The hydraulic systems that made the massive control surfaces move were dying. Soon, they'd have almost nothing. Behind them in the cabin, hell had erupted. The decompression had blown a 3-foot hole in the fuselage near row 23, right where the engine debris had punctured through. Oxygen masks dangled like yellow jellyfish above terrified passengers. Luggage had exploded from overhead bins, flying through the cabin like missiles. A businessman's laptop computer had shattered against a window. A child's stuffed animal tumbled through the aisle. Flight attendant Maria Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, grabbed the intercom handset despite the violent shaking. "Brace. Remain seated. Fasten your SCATBLTS." Her voice projected calm authority even as her knuckles were white from gripping the galley counter. A young mother in row 18 clutched her 6-year-old son, tears streaming down her face as she tried to secure his oxygen mask with shaking hands. An elderly man prayed in Spanish, rosary beads clicking through his fingers. A college student frantically typed what might be her last text message to her parents. "I love you. Plane in trouble." "Jessica, what do we have?" David's voice cut through, steadier now, falling back on training. She forced herself to think, to analyze, to become the combat pilot she'd once been. Pull up the emergency checklist for engine fire and severe hydraulic failure. I need damage assessment on all systems. Her eyes scanned the instrument panel. It looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights. 3 hydraulic systems. Normally they had redundancy for days, all showing critical low pressure. The fuel imbalance between wings was growing every second. They were dumping hundreds of gallons per minute from that hole in the wing. "Fuel state," she demanded. "We've got maybe 45 minutes before we're running on fumes," David reported, his voice tight. "But that's assuming the leak doesn't get worse." 45 minutes. Jessica's mind raced through calculations. Their altitude was 35,000 feet. They needed to descend. The cabin pressure was unstable, and people might already be getting hypoxic. But descending too fast with damaged flight controls could rip the aircraft apart. New York Center, United 447, requesting immediate vectors for emergency landing. We need the closest suitable airport with long runways and full emergency equipment. United 447, nearest suitable is Philadelphia International, bearing 215.43 miles. Runways 27L and 27R are available, 10,500 and 12,000 feet respectively. Philadelphia, 43 miles. Under normal circumstances, barely 10 minutes of flying time. But nothing about this was normal. Jessica's eyes fell on the moving map display and something made her pause. Her combat pilot instincts, the same ones that whispered warnings this morning, were screaming at her now. She saw Philadelphia marked clearly, but her eyes drifted slightly south. McGuire Air Force Base, 32 miles away. "David, pull up McGuire Air Force Base specifications." "What, Jessica? Philadelphia is right there. They're expecting us." "Just do it," the command voice. The voice that had ordered cargo drops over hostile territory, that had made life-or-death calls in combat zones. David's fingers flew over the flight management computer. McGuire, runway 5,000 feet, military installation. Crash equipment rated for. He stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They've got specialized equipment for military catastrophes," Jessica said quietly. "And there are 2 million fewer people living below their approach path." The aircraft shuddered again, reminding them that philosophical debates were luxuries they couldn't afford. Jessica made her decision, the one that would be dissected by investigators, debated by aviation experts, and questioned by regulators for years to come. New York Center, United 447, requesting McGuire Air Force Base for emergency landing. We are not confident in our ability to maintain controlled flight for the distance to Philadelphia. McGuire is closer and better equipped for our damage profile." There was a pause, a long, heavy pause that felt like eternity. "United 447, stand by." In that moment of silence, Jessica looked at David. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his hands were steady on the controls now. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. Jessica thought of Emma's arms around her neck that morning, of the 342 souls behind them trusting her judgment, of the impossible math of survival that was screaming there was only one choice, the unconventional one. "No," she admitted, "but I'm sure about Philadelphia even less." The radio crackled to life. "United 447, you are cleared for emergency approach McGuire Air Force Base. Runway 6, wind 40 at 8. Emergency equipment is rolling. Godspeed." Jessica's jaw set. "Copy. United 447 descending." She pushed the nose down, beginning their descent into hell. 17 minutes to save them all. The clock was ticking. The descent began like falling into an abyss. Jessica eased the nose down, fighting every instinct that screamed to keep altitude. Altitude was safety. Altitude gave you options. Altitude gave you time. But with a gaping hole in the fuselage and passengers struggling to breathe through oxygen masks, staying at 35,000 feet meant certain death from hypoxia. Descending with crippled flight controls meant possible death from loss of control. She chose possible over certain. "Target descent rate 2,000 feet per minute," she told David, her voice mechanical, detached. It was the only way to function, become the machine, suppress the terror, execute the procedures. Monitor airspeed. We go above 290 knots and we risk structural failure. Copy. David's hands hovered over the throttles, ready to adjust thrust at her command. The kid was holding together. She was proud of him for that. The altimeter unwound like a countdown clock. 34,000 feet. 33,500. 33,000. Each 1,000 feet closer to the ground felt like shedding a layer of safety. But through the cockpit window, Jessica could see the fuel still streaming from the wing, a silvery contrail of their lifeblood evaporating into the atmosphere. "Fuel state update," she demanded. David's fingers worked the calculations on the flight management computer. His face went ashen. "Jessica, at current leak rate, we have 32 minutes before total fuel exhaustion, maybe less." 32 minutes. The number hit Jessica like a physical blow. McGuire was 32 miles away. Under normal circumstances, they'd make it with time to spare. But they weren't flying normal. They were nursing a dying aircraft through the sky, and every second brought new complications. The radio crackled. "United 447, New York Center. Be advised you have traffic at your 2 o'clock, 5 miles, descending through your altitude. American 2156. "Negative contact," Jessica replied, her eyes scanning the sky even as her hands fought the controls. The last thing they needed was a mid-air collision. "American 2156, turn left heading 180, immediate. Emergency aircraft on approach." Jessica barely registered the other traffic being vectored away. Her world had narrowed to a tunnel, fuel gauges, hydraulic pressure, airspeed, altitude. The numbers told a story of cascading failure, each system feeding into the next like dominoes falling in slow motion. "David, I need you to run worst-case scenarios. If we lose all hydraulics, and I mean all, what do we have?" David's fingers flew across the tablet, pulling up emergency procedures they'd trained for but never imagined using. "We'd be down to..." "Jesus, Jess, we'd be down to manual flight controls only. That means physical cable connections to some surfaces, but the 777 wasn't designed for full manual. The control forces would be enormous, I know." Jessica's arms already ached from fighting the wounded aircraft. The thought of losing even the partial hydraulic assist they still had made her stomach clench. But doable. "In theory," David met her eyes. "No one's ever actually done it in a 777, not with this kind of damage. First time for everything." The gallows humor fell flat. They both knew the statistics. Catastrophic hydraulic failure in commercial aviation had a mortality rate approaching 90%. United 232 in Sioux City had ended with 111 dead despite heroic efforts. Japan Airlines 123 had killed 520. The odds were not in their favor. At 25,000 feet, the master caution alarm sounded again. A new problem. "Fire warning, right wing." David's hand shot to the fire suppression system. Jessica's eyes snapped to the engine display. The number 2 engine, already shut down and supposedly isolated, was showing a heat signature building in the wing structure. The fuel leak was creating a vapor cloud, and something, friction, electrical arcing, sheer bad luck, was igniting it. "Deploy fire bottle for engine 2, Jessica commanded. David slammed the fire handle and twisted, releasing the halon suppressant into the engine compartment. For 10 agonizing seconds, they watched the temperature gauge. It dropped slightly, then stabilized, but it didn't go out completely. "It's not extinguishing," David said, his voice cracking for the first time. "The fuel vapor is reigniting faster than we can suppress it." Jessica's mind raced through the options, each one worse than the last. If the fire spread to the wing's main structure, they'd lose structural integrity. The wing could literally fold off the aircraft. But if they didn't get on the ground soon, They'd run out of fuel or lose all hydraulic control. There were no good choices, only less terrible ones. "How much time to Maguire?" she asked. "At current speed and descent rate, 14 minutes. 14 minutes. An eternity. A heartbeat." Jessica looked at the fuel gauge again, the needle dropping like sand through an hourglass. She looked at the hydraulic pressure indicators, all three systems showing yellow caution zones, threatening to go red. She looked at the fire warning, a persistent amber light that could turn into catastrophic structural failure at any moment. The radio, United 447 Maguire Tower. "We have you on radar 28 miles northeast. Runway 6 is clear, winds 50 at 9 knots, emergency equipment standing by. What is your approach speed and expected landing weight?" Expected landing weight. The question was routine, necessary for calculating stopping distance, but Jessica realized with growing horror that she didn't have a normal answer. "Maguire Tower, United 447. We cannot dump fuel, we're already losing it through the leak. Current weight approximately 480,000 pounds. That's," she did the math quickly, "that's 180,000 pounds over maximum landing weight." The silence on the radio spoke volumes. Landing that heavy would put enormous stress on the landing gear, on the brakes, on the entire aircraft structure. The runway at Maguire was 10,000 feet, adequate for a normal 777 landing, but with their excessive weight and damaged systems, stopping in that distance became problematic. "United 447, copy your weight. Recommend final approach speed." Jessica pulled up the landing calculations, but the numbers made no sense. The aircraft's computer was designed for normal operations, not for flying a bullet-riddled wreck. She'd have to estimate, and if she got it wrong, they'd either stall on approach and crash short, or land too fast and run off the runway. "We'll be fast, Tower. Estimate 185 knots over the threshold. We have minimal control authority. I can't fly this thing slow." Beside her, David's eyes widened. Normal landing speed was around 140 knots. She was planning to hit the runway doing nearly 215 miles per hour in an aircraft weighing as much as a small office building, with damaged brakes and questionable landing gear. It was insane. It violated every principle of safe flying, and it was their only chance. "Jessica," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the cockpit alarms. "Are you sure we shouldn't try for Philadelphia? They have longer runways, more emergency equipment." For a moment, just a moment, Jessica doubted herself. Second-guessed the decision that would define the rest of her life, however long that might be. Philadelphia was the safe choice, the conventional choice, the choice that would protect her career and reputation. Then she looked at the fuel gauge again, looked at the fire warning, looked at the hydraulic pressure dropping in real time, and she knew. "We'd never make it to Philadelphia," she said simply. "We have one shot, David. One chance to get this bird on the ground before it kills everyone aboard. Maguire is that chance." She keyed the radio. "Maguire Tower, United 447. We are committed to your field. Be advised, we may have fire on landing. We may have landing gear failure. We may not be able to stop on the runway. Clear all personnel from the approach path and overrun areas." "United 447 Maguire. Understood. The base is yours. We're ready for you." 24 miles to go. 11 minutes of flying time. Jessica's hands gripped the yoke so tight her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, 342 people sat in terrified silence, some praying, some crying, some staring blankly at the seatbacks in front of them, their minds unable to process the reality of their situation. In the cockpit, two pilots fought against physics, against probability, against the merciless mathematics of catastrophic failure. Every second the aircraft stayed in the sky was a minor miracle. Every mile closer to Maguire defied the odds. But Jessica had stopped believing in miracles years ago. She believed in training, in experience, in the cold calculation of aerodynamic forces and structural limits. She believed in making the right choice even when all choices were terrible. She believed in doing whatever it took to get her people home. The altimeter passed through 15,000 feet. The ground was getting closer. So was the moment of truth. Jessica Morgan took a deep breath and prepared to do the impossible. 200 miles away at Joint Base Langley, Virginia, Major Sarah Chen was finishing her third cup of coffee when the scramble alert shattered the quiet morning. The klaxon wailed through the fighter squadron ready room, and Sarah's body moved on pure instinct. 15 years as an F-22 Raptor pilot had hardwired the response into her nervous system. She was sprinting toward her aircraft before her conscious mind had fully processed the alert. Major CHEN, Captain Reed, scramble, 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 the loudspeaker boomed. Commercial aviation emergency northeast corridor, possible catastrophic failure, this is not a drill. Sarah's heart kicked into overdrive as she grabbed her helmet and ran across the tarmac. Her crew chief already had the F-22's canopy open, the twin Pratt and Whitney engines spooling up with their characteristic high-pitched whine. Behind her, Captain Marcus Reed, her wingman, was racing toward his own Raptor. "What's the situation?" Sarah shouted over the engine noise as she climbed the ladder. "United 777, catastrophic engine failure heading for Maguire," her crew chief yelled back. "NORAD wants eyes on target. They're worried about." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Post 9/11 protocols meant any major aviation incident near populated areas got military response. Fast. They needed to visually confirm this was an accident, not something worse. Sarah strapped in with practice speed, her fingers flying through the abbreviated combat launch checklist. Normally, pre-flight took 20 minutes. Today she had 90 seconds. Viper 15 cleared for immediate takeoff, runway 26, the tower controller's voice crackled in her helmet. Squawk 7700, contact Potomac departure on 327.4. Good luck. Sarah slammed the throttles forward, the afterburners kicked in with a thunderous roar, and 64,000 pounds of thrust launched her down the runway. The F-22 Raptor lifted off after barely 1,500 feet, clawing into the sky at a 50-degree angle. Behind her, Marcus was tucked in tight formation, both fighters accelerating through Mach 1 before they'd even retracted their landing gear. Potomac departure, Viper 15 flight, 2 F-22s, passing Angels 12 supersonic requesting vectors to emergency aircraft. Viper 15 radar contact. Target bears 35 at 87 miles, descending through 18,000 feet, ground speed 380 knots. Be advised, aircraft is reported to have catastrophic damage, fire, and fuel leak. Approach with extreme caution. Sarah's blood ran cold. Fire and fuel leak. That was a recipe for mid-air explosion, and they were vectoring her straight toward it at nearly 900 miles per hour. Copy all, Viper 15 is in pursuit. The distance closed rapidly. At supersonic speed, the F-22s ate up the miles like hungry wolves. Sarah's radar painted the target, a large, slow-moving aircraft descending steadily. 60 miles, 40 miles, 20 miles. Viper 15, recommend subsonic for visual approach. Target at your 12 o'clock, 15 miles. Sarah pulled back the throttles, bleeding off speed. The sonic boom rippled behind them as they decelerated through Mach 1. Her eyes scanned the sky ahead, searching for the wounded airliner. Then she saw it. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. Even from 10 miles away, she could see the fuel vapor trailing from the Boeing 777's right wing, a silvery contrail that caught the sunlight like a banner of doom. As she closed the distance, the full horror of the situation became apparent. "Viper 2, you seeing this?" she asked Marcus. "Affirmative, that's," That's bad, Sarah, really bad. Sarah pulled alongside the 777, matching its speed at 380 knots, positioning herself 500 feet off the right wing. What she saw made her 15 years of combat experience seem meaningless. She'd seen damaged aircraft before, battle-damaged fighters limping home, UAVs shot to pieces. But this was a commercial airliner with hundreds of people aboard, and it looked like it had been through a war zone. The number 2 engine was a twisted wreck, the cowling peeled back like a blooming flower of metal. A gaping hole punctured the fuselage near the wing root. She could actually see into the cabin, see the chaos inside. And the fuel. God, the fuel was streaming from the wing in sheets, evaporating in the slipstream. The entire aircraft was wallowing through the sky, yawing noticeably to the right, the pilots clearly fighting for every second of controlled flight. Potomac, Viper 15 has visual on United 447. Confirmed catastrophic uncontained engine failure, visible fuselage breach approximately 3 feet in diameter, heavy fuel leak from right wing, and visible fire signatures near engine mount. Aircraft is barely controllable. Pilot is doing an incredible job keeping it in the air. Sarah eased her F-22 closer, until she could see into the 777's cockpit. 2 figures hunched over the controls, both pulling on the yoke. Even from her position, she could see the strain in their body language, the tension, the desperation, the sheer physical effort of flying a machine that no longer wanted to fly. United 447, this is Raptor Viper 15, U.S. Air Force. I'm off your right wing. How copy? For a moment, only static. Then a female voice came through, strained, tight, but utterly composed. It was the voice of someone operating at the absolute edge of their capabilities, yet refusing to break. Viper 15, United 447. We copy. Situation critical. We've lost primary hydraulics, bleeding fuel, and have fire warnings. Attempting emergency landing Maguire Air Force Base. Sarah's respect for the unknown pilot skyrocketed. That voice carried the unmistakable tone of military training, calm under fire, precise communication despite the chaos. United 447, understand Maguire. I'm going to stay with you all the way. Can you give me a damage assessment? 3 hydraulic systems at critical low pressure. Fuel leak estimated 800 pounds per minute. Flight controls at maybe 30% effectiveness. We're hand-flying this on manual reversion. And Viper. The voice paused, and Sarah heard something crack in that iron composure just for a second. We have 342 souls on board. 342 people. Sarah glanced at the fuselage again, imagining the terror inside that aluminum tube. Families, children, people who'd kissed their loved ones goodbye this morning, never imagining they'd be fighting for their lives before lunch. I understand, 447, you're doing an amazing job. I've got Marcus, Viper 16, taking your left side. We'll escort you home. Marcus slid his F-22 into position off the 777's left wing, the 2 sleek fighters bracketing the wounded giant like protective guardian angels. Sarah had flown combat missions over hostile territory, had faced surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters, but nothing had prepared her for the helpless feeling of watching 342 people hovering on the knife's edge between life and death, unable to do anything but bear witness. United 447, can you maintain current descent rate? Affirmative, but we're running out of time. Fuel state is critical. We estimate 12 minutes to fuel exhaustion. 12 minutes. Sarah checked her navigation display. Maguire was 15 miles ahead. The math was brutally simple. They might not make it. Viper 15, Potomac departure. Maguire Tower reports they have the aircraft on final approach radar. Distance to runway, 14 miles. You are cleared to escort to landing. Sarah keyed her radio to the tower frequency. Maguire Tower, Viper 15. I have eyes on United 447. Be advised, this aircraft is in severe distress. The pilot is performing miracles just keeping it airborne. Recommend all emergency equipment and clear the base for crash landing procedures. Viper 15 McGuire, understood. Base is locked down, all personnel clear of runway and approach path. Crash equipment is standing by. Sarah edged her Raptor closer to the 777, close enough to see the details. Close enough to see passengers' faces pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with terror. Close enough to see the female captain in the left seat, her hands white-knuckled on the controls, her jaw set with fierce determination. And in that moment, Sarah understood. This wasn't just a pilot trying to save an aircraft. This was a warrior refusing to surrender, refusing to let death claim her people. Sarah had seen that look before, in the mirror, after combat missions where everything went wrong but you brought your wingman home anyway. United 447 Viper 15. I don't know your name, but I want you to know something. Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. You're not alone up here. We're with you. Whatever happens, we're right here. The response came back immediately, and Sarah heard the gratitude mixed with determination. Copy that, Viper. Call sign is, just call me Guardian. Sarah didn't know where the name came from. Maybe the pilot had made it up on the spot, but it fit perfectly. This woman was guarding 342 lives with everything she had. Roger that, Guardian. Let's get you home. 10 miles to McGuire. The 777 descended through 8,000 feet, still bleeding fuel, still fighting the controls, still defying the odds with every second that ticked past. Sarah watched the altimeter unwind and the distance close, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She'd flown hundreds of combat sorties. She'd faced death more times than she could count. But she'd never felt tension like this, never watched someone else's life or death struggle with such visceral intensity. United 447, you're 5 miles from the threshold. How are you doing? We're still here, Viper, preparing for landing sequence. Sarah saw the gear doors begin to open on the 777's belly, and her breath caught. Deploying the landing gear in this condition could destabilize the entire aircraft. But the pilot had no choice. You couldn't land without gear. The main landing gear extended and the Boeing shuddered violently, dropping 200 feet in an instant. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her throttle, a useless gesture. There was nothing she could do to help. But the 777 recovered. Somehow, impossibly, the pilot wrestled it back under control. Guardian's got skills, Marcus said quietly over the radio, awe evident in his voice. Yeah, Sarah agreed, watching the drama unfold. Yeah, she does. 3 miles to the runway. The moment of truth was coming fast. 3 miles had never seemed so far. Jessica's arms screamed in agony, muscles burning with lactic acid as she fought the control yoke. Every micro-adjustment required the strength of a wrestler. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, soaking through her uniform shirt. She couldn't wipe it away. Both hands were locked on the controls, trembling with effort. 2 miles to threshold, David called out, his voice hoarse. He'd been helping her muscle the controls for the last 10 minutes, and his arms looked ready to give out too. Airspeed 195 knots, altitude 2,800 feet, descent rate 800 feet per minute. Too fast. Everything was too fast. But slowing down meant stalling, and stalling meant dropping from the sky like a brick. Jessica had to ride the razor's edge between controllable and catastrophic. Fire warning, fire warning. The cockpit erupted with new alarms. Jessica's eyes snapped to the engine display. The right wing was fully engulfed now. The fuel vapor had ignited into actual flames spreading along the wing's trailing edge. The temperature gauge spiked into the red zone. She could see orange reflections dancing across the cockpit instruments. Fire bottle 2, deploy now, Jessica commanded. David's hand slammed the fire suppression handle. The halon discharge light illuminated, but the fire warning didn't silence. The flames were feeding on atomized fuel faster than the suppressant could extinguish them. "It's not working," David's voice cracked with panic. "Jessica, the wing is on fire and we're still 2 miles out." "I know," Jessica's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. "We're not stopping, we're committed." In her peripheral vision through the right cockpit window, she could see the F-22 Raptor packing them. Major Chen's fighter had dropped back slightly, giving the burning 777 more space. Smart. If they exploded, she didn't want to take the F-22 with them. United 447 Viper 15. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a rock. "I see the fire. You're trailing flames about 40 feet behind your right wing, but you're still flying. You've got this, Guardian." Guardian. The call sign Sarah had given her felt like both a blessing and a curse. 342 people were counting on her to guard them from death. But how do you guard against an aircraft that's literally burning out of the sky? 1.5 miles, David announced. "Gear down and locked. Flaps. Flaps are only deploying to 15 degrees. We're not getting full extension." Of course they weren't. Nothing was working right. The hydraulics were so degraded that the flaps, critical wing surfaces that increased lift and drag for landing, could barely move. Landing without full flaps meant they'd hit the runway even faster. "What's our speed across the threshold going to be?" Jessica demanded. David's fingers worked the calculations frantically. "At this descent rate and configuration, 185 knots, maybe 190. 190 knots, 219 miles per hour. Jessica had landed C-17s in combat zones on dirt strips, but never anything this heavy, this fast, this damaged. The 777's landing gear was rated for certain impact forces. Exceed those forces and the gear would collapse like aluminum foil. United 447 Maguire Tower. You are 1 mile from threshold. Wind 60 at 8 knots. Runway is clear. All equipment is standing by. Jessica could see the runway now, a concrete ribbon stretching ahead, lined with emergency vehicles. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash equipment painted in yellow and red. Dozens of them. It looked like every piece of emergency equipment on the entire base had been mobilized. Good, they were going to need all of it. "Flight attendants, brace for impact," Jessica said into the cabin intercom, her voice projecting calm she didn't feel. 30 seconds. In the cabin, Maria Rodriguez's voice echoed through the passenger address system. "Brace, brace, HEADS down, stay down." 342 people assumed crash positions, heads between knees, hands locked behind their heads, bodies tensed for an impact that might be the last thing they ever felt. A businessman in first class whispered the Lord's Prayer. A teenage girl clutched her mother's hand so tight both their fingers had gone white. An off-duty pilot in row 34 watched through the window, understanding exactly how impossible this landing was about to be. The ground rushed up to meet them. Jessica could see individual details now, runway lights, painted markers, the threshold stripes. 1/2 mile. The altimeter unwound like a countdown to doom. 800 feet, 700, 600. Sink rate, sink rate. The ground proximity warning system screamed at her. "I know," Jessica shouted back at the automated voice. Her forearms bulged as she pulled back on the yoke, trying to arrest their descent rate. The nose lifted slightly, but they were still coming down too fast. 400 feet, 1/4 mile. The fire warning intensified. Through her side window, Jessica caught a glimpse of actual flames streaming from the wing, a 40-foot ribbon of fire trailing behind them like a banner from hell. "Stay with me, David." Jessica's voice cut through the alarms. "I need you on the controls. When we touch down, I need full braking and reverse thrust on engines 1 and 3. You understand?" "I've got it." David's hands were poised, ready. 200 feet, the runway filled their windscreen. Major Sarah Chen's F-22 peeled away, unable to follow them down. Her last radio call was simple: "Godspeed, Guardian." 100 feet. Jessica could see the faces of firefighters in the crashed trucks lining the runway, grown men and women with decades of experience, watching with expressions of dread and hope. 50 feet. The 777 was a 500,000-pound missile hurling toward concrete at 190 knots. Jessica's entire world narrowed to three things: airspeed, altitude, and the centerline painted on the runway. Nothing else existed. Not the fire, not the fear, not the impossible odds. Just the landing. 30 feet, 20. "Here we go," Jessica shouted. The main landing gear kissed the concrete, and all hell broke loose. The impact was catastrophic. The Boeing bounced violently, slamming back into the air as the overstressed landing gear absorbed forces it was never designed for. Passengers screamed. Overhead bins exploded open. The cockpit shook so hard Jessica's vision blurred. "Stay on IT," she roared, fighting the controls. The aircraft came down again, harder this time. The right main gear, already weakened by shrapnel damage, began to fail. Jessica heard the sickening screech of collapsing metal, felt the aircraft lurch violently to the right. They were veering off the runway at 180 knots. "We're losing it," David screamed. The grass shoulder appeared in Jessica's peripheral vision, rushing closer. If they hit the grass at this speed with the gear collapsing, they'd cartwheel. The aircraft would disintegrate. Everyone would die. No, absolutely not, not today. In that microsecond, Jessica's mind flashed to her C-17 training, asymmetric thrust procedures for crosswind landings. It was a cargo plane technique, not something commercial pilots did, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Full left thrust," she commanded, her hands already moving. Her right hand slammed the number 1 and 3 engine throttles to maximum power, while her feet stood on the rudder pedals with superhuman force. The physics shouldn't work. Applying full thrust on one side during landing should spin them into an uncontrollable ground loop. But Jessica wasn't following the physics textbook, she was rewriting it. The left engines roared to full power. The asymmetric thrust, combined with her full rudder input and the dying hydraulics she was muscling with everything she had, created a force vector that defied logic. The 777's nose swung back toward centerline. "Impossible," David breathed. But it was happening. The aircraft straightened impossibly, skating on the collapsing right gear, showering sparks across the runway like a fireworks display. Metal screamed against concrete. The sound was apocalyptic, a banshee wail of tortured aluminum. "Full brakes," Jessica commanded. David's hands flew to the brake handles, applying maximum pressure. The anti-skid system fought to keep the wheels from locking up. Hydraulic fluid pressure dropped to almost nothing, but they had just enough, just barely enough. The runway markers flew past, 8,000 feet remaining, 7,000, 6,000. They were still doing 140 knots, too fast, still too fast. "Reverse thrust," Jessica yelled. The engine reversers deployed with a thunderous roar, redirecting thrust forward to slow them down. The deceleration pressed Jessica against her harness. Her arms trembled, every muscle fiber screaming in protest. 5,000 feet of runway left, speed, 120 knots. 4,000 feet, speed, 100 knots. The right gear was completely gone now. They were sliding on the metal stub, grinding along the runway, carving a gouge in the concrete. 3,000 feet, speed, 80 knots. Fire trucks raced alongside them, foam spraying onto the burning wing. 2,000 feet, speed, 60 knots. Jessica could see the end of the runway approaching. Beyond it, grass, dirt, and a fence, if they didn't stop in time. 1,000 feet, speed 40 knots. Come on, Jessica begged the aircraft. Stop. 500 feet, speed 25 knots. The Boeing 777, burning and broken, ground down the runway on collapsing gear and sheer willpower. 300 feet, speed 15 knots. 200 feet, speed 10 knots. 100 feet, speed 5 knots. And then impossibly, miraculously, they stopped. 300 feet from the runway's end, 300 feet from disaster. For 3 heartbeats, absolute silence filled the cockpit. The engines spooled down. The alarms finally quieted. Foam covered the right wing, suppressing the flames. Jessica's hands slowly released the controls. Her fingers wouldn't straighten. They'd locked into claws from gripping so hard for so long. She keyed the cabin intercom. Her voice was barely a whisper. Evacuate, evacuate aircraft. She'd done it. Against every law of physics, every statistical probability, every expert's prediction, she'd brought them home. All 342 souls. Alive. The emergency evacuation slides deployed with a hiss of compressed air, inflating like yellow tongues from the aircraft's exits. Jessica sat frozen in her seat for one precious second, her body refusing to believe they were actually on the ground. Alive. Safe. Then training kicked in. David, go. Get out, she commanded, unbuckling her harness with fingers that barely responded. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grasp the metal release. David stared at her, his face pale as chalk. Jessica, we need to. Gio, I'll do the cabin check. Move. He stumbled out of his seat and fled toward the cockpit door. Jessica forced herself upright, her legs nearly buckling. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning for 23 minutes was draining away, leaving behind only pain and exhaustion. She grabbed the flashlight from its mount and pushed through the cockpit door into the cabin. Chaos greeted her. Passengers scrambled over seats, fighting toward the exits. Overhead bins hung open, contents spilled everywhere. Oxygen masks dangled like dead jellyfish. And through the gaping hole in the fuselage near row 23, she could see daylight and smell the acrid stench of fire suppression foam. Move, keep moving. Maria Rodriguez stood at the forward door, directing the evacuation with iron composure despite the tears streaming down her face. Do not take your luggage. Gio, Gio, Gio. Passengers slid down the evacuation chutes, tumbling onto the tarmac where firefighters caught them and rushed them away from the burning aircraft. A mother clutched her young son so tightly the boy couldn't breathe. An elderly man in a wheelchair was being carried by 2 flight attendants. A businessman slid down still clutching his briefcase, despite Maria's commands. Jessica moved through the cabin against the flow of evacuating passengers, checking every row. She swept her flashlight under seats, into the lavatories, anywhere someone might be trapped or unconscious. Row 12 empty. Row 18 empty. Row 23, the hole gaped like a wound, edges twisted and sharp. Emergency air rushed through carrying smoke. Empty. Captain, a voice called from the back. Jessica's heart lurched. She sprinted down the aisle, finding a flight attendant struggling with a teenage girl who'd wedged herself into a corner, paralyzed with terror. The girl's eyes were wide and unseeing, her breathing rapid and shallow, full panic attack. I've got her, Jessica said, her voice dropping to that calm, authoritative tone that cut through fear. She knelt in front of the girl, making eye contact. Look at me. Look right at me. What's your name? Sarah, the girl stammered. Sarah, I'm Captain Morgan. We're on the ground, we're safe. But we need to get off this airplane right now. Can you walk? The girl shook her head frantically. Okay, then I'm going to carry you. Is that all right? A tiny nod. Jessica ignored her screaming muscles and lifted the girl, maybe 90 pounds, in a firefighter's carry. Her legs nearly gave out, but she steadied herself against a seatback and started moving toward the rear exit. "Captain, you need to get out," the flight attendant protested. "I can." "Move, that's an order." They reached the rear exit where another attendant was directing the last stragglers down the slide. Jessica handed Sarah to the attendant. "Get her down safe." "But Captain..." "Gio." They disappeared down the slide. Jessica turned and made one final sweep of the cabin. The smoke was getting thicker now. The fire suppression foam was working, but fire still smoldered somewhere in the wing structure. The cabin was filling with toxic fumes. She moved faster, checking the last rows. Empty, empty, the galley, the rear lavatories, empty. "Anyone still aboard?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the hollow cabin. "Last call, anyone here?" Silence. Jessica ran forward, her lungs burning from smoke inhalation. Past the hole in the fuselage, past the scattered luggage and debris, past row after row of empty seats that had held terrified people just moments ago. She reached the forward door where Maria still stood, tears streaming but face set with determination. "You're the last one, Captain," Maria said. "Everyone else is off. You're supposed to be off too. After you, that's the rule." They locked eyes for a moment, two professionals who just lived through hell together. "Together then," Jessica said. They stepped to the door. The evacuation slide billowed below them, firefighters waving frantically. Through the smoke and foam, Jessica could see hundreds of people scattered across the tarmac, passengers and crew, all alive, all safe. All 342 souls. Her knees buckled. Maria caught her. "Come on, Captain, almost done." They slid down together, landing in the arms of waiting firefighters who practically carried them away from the aircraft. The moment Jessica's feet touched solid ground 50 meters from the wreckage, her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the tarmac, gasping for air, her entire body trembling. "I need a medic here," someone shouted. Hands lifted her, placed her on a stretcher. An oxygen mask covered her face. Jessica tried to push it away. She needed to see, needed to confirm everyone was accounted for. "Ma'am, please, you need oxygen. You've been breathing smoke." "The passengers," Jessica croaked. "Are they?" "They're safe, Captain. Everyone's off. You got them all." The words hit her like a physical force. Everyone. All 342. The impossible number that had haunted every second of those 23 minutes in the air. She closed her eyes and let the medics work. Around her, controlled chaos reigned. Triage stations were set up across the tarmac. Most passengers were uninjured, bruises, minor cuts, psychological trauma. 3 serious injuries: a broken arm from the violent landing, a concussion from flying luggage, and a passenger who'd had a heart attack from sheer terror but was being stabilized by paramedics. No fatalities, not one. News helicopters circled overhead, cameras capturing everything. Within minutes, footage would spread across every media outlet in the world. The shattered Boeing 777, one landing gear completely gone, flames still being doused by firefighters, emergency slides still deployed, and hundreds of survivors being led to safety. The miracle at McGuire. Federal investigators were already arriving. The National Transportation Safety Board would want answers. The FAA would review every decision Jessica made. Her choice to divert to McGuire instead of Philadelphia would be scrutinized. Her unconventional landing technique would be debated in aviation schools for decades. But right now, lying on a stretcher with an oxygen mask on her face, Jessica didn't care about any of that. She'd brought them home. Against impossible odds, against catastrophic failure, against the cruel mathematics of disaster, she'd brought every single soul home. 2 F-22 Raptors screamed overhead in a victory pass, afterburners blazing. Major Sarah Chen and Captain Marcus Reed, saluting the warrior who just defied death itself. Jessica raised one trembling hand in acknowledgement. Then the exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, and darkness claimed her. 2 hours later, Jessica woke in a medical tent, an IV in her arm. Her first conscious thought was a single word: passengers. A nurse smiled. "All alive, Captain. You've got bruised ribs, strained muscles in both arms, smoke inhalation, and severe exhaustion. But you're going to be fine." Through the tent opening, Jessica could see the aircraft in the distance. Investigators swarmed over it like ants. The cockpit voice recorder had already been recovered. Her every word, every decision, every moment of terror would be analyzed. A figure appeared in the tent entrance. First Officer David Chen, his arm in a sling but otherwise intact. His face crumpled when he saw her awake. "Jess," he whispered, "what you did up there, I've never seen anything like it. You saved us all." Jessica tried to speak, but her throat was raw. David held up his phone, showing her the screen. News footage played on loop. The landing, the evacuation, the miraculous survival. The headline read, "Female pilot SAVES 342 in impossible landing. EXPERTS call IT greatest feat of aviation skill in modern history." "The media wants interviews," David said. "Everyone does. You're a hero, Jessica." But Jessica turned her face away. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd stared into the abyss and barely survived. The weight of those 23 minutes, the impossible decisions, the physical agony, the terror of possibly failing 342 people, sat on her chest like a stone. "I need to be alone," she whispered. David nodded, understanding, and slipped out. Jessica closed her eyes, but all she could see was the fire warning lights, feel the controls fighting her, hear the screams from the cabin. She'd saved them all, but part of her had been left behind in that cockpit, in those impossible minutes when the line between life and death had been measured in fractions of degrees and pounds of thrust. The nightmares, she knew, were just beginning. 6 months later, Jessica Morgan stood in her kitchen at 3:47 a.m., hands trembling as she poured her fourth cup of coffee. Sleep had become the enemy. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that cockpit, watching the fuel gauge plummet, feeling the controls fight her, hearing the fire warning scream. The nightmares were always the same. She'd be approaching Maguire, but this time the runway would vanish, or the landing gear would collapse too soon, or the wing would explode. And in every nightmare, she'd watch helplessly as 342 souls plummeted to Earth. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, Emma and her 12-year-old son Marcus rushing into her room with terrified faces. "Mom, Mom, you're okay, you're home." But was she? Jessica wasn't sure anymore. The kitchen table was buried under paperwork. NTSB investigative reports, FAA compliance reviews, insurance documents, lawsuit depositions. 3 passengers were suing despite surviving, claiming emotional trauma, and everywhere constantly the media requests. 60 Minutes wanted an exclusive interview. The Today Show had called 17 times. Publishers were offering 6-figure book deals. Hollywood producers wanted to option her story. Even the White House had extended an invitation for a medal ceremony. Jessica had declined everything. She'd given one statement to investigators, participated in the mandatory debriefings, and then vanished from public view. The world called her a hero. Aviation experts analyzed the cockpit voice recording and declared her landing statistically impossible, a feat that defied aerodynamic probability. Simulator recreations showed that 97% of attempts to replicate her landing ended in catastrophic crashes. But Jessica couldn't see herself as a hero. All she could see were the moments she'd almost failed, the split-second decisions that could have gone wrong, the luck, blind, random luck that had kept them airborne just long enough. "Mom!" Jessica spun, coffee sloshing over her hand. Emma stood in the doorway, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched against her chest. "Baby, what are you doing up?" You were making noise again. Emma's voice was small. At 8 years old, she was too young to fully understand what her mother had been through, but old enough to sense the change. Did you have another bad dream? Jessica set down the coffee mug and knelt, opening her arms. Emma rushed into them, and Jessica held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. I'm okay, sweetheart, just couldn't sleep. Because of the airplane. Yeah, because of the airplane. Emma pulled back, her young face serious beyond her years. But you saved everyone, Mommy. Everyone says so. Why are you still sad? How do you explain survivor's guilt to an 8-year-old? How do you describe the weight of 342 lives, the crushing responsibility, the knowledge that one wrong move would have killed them all? Sometimes, Jessica said carefully, even when things turn out okay, the scary parts stay with us for a while. But I'm getting better, I promise. It was a lie. She wasn't getting better. 3 months earlier, the NTSB final hearing had been held in a Washington, D.C. conference room packed with media, investigators, and aviation officials. Jessica sat at a table, flanked by union representatives and lawyers, while investigators presented their findings. Lead investigator Thomas Chen, no relation to David, stood before a projection screen showing the destroyed engine. The catastrophic failure was caused by a metallurgical defect in the high-pressure turbine disc. The disc fractured at cruise altitude, sending debris through the containment ring at velocities exceeding 1,200 feet per second. Images flashed on screen. The shredded engine cowling, the punctured fuselage, the severed hydraulic lines. Each photo made Jessica's hands clench tighter under the table. The debris severed all 3 hydraulic systems within 2.3 seconds. Captain Morgan and First Officer Chen were left flying a 500,000-pound aircraft with essentially manual controls, a scenario not survivable according to every simulation we've run. The investigator paused, looking directly at Jessica. Captain Morgan's decision to divert to McGuire Air Force Base rather than continue to Philadelphia International was controversial. However, our analysis shows that the aircraft would not have remained controllable for the additional flight time required to reach Philadelphia. Her judgment, based on real-time assessment of the deteriorating situation, saved lives. A reporter shouted from the gallery, "Captain Morgan, how did you know you couldn't make it to Philadelphia?" Jessica's lawyer started to object, but Jessica raised a hand. She stood slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't know, not for certain, but I understood the mathematics of failure, fuel leak rate, hydraulic degradation, fire progression. Philadelphia was the safe choice on paper. McGuire was the survivable choice in reality. Some critics say you risked a military installation unnecessarily." Those critics weren't in the cockpit. Jessica's voice hardened. They weren't feeling the controls die beneath their hands. They weren't calculating whether they had 12 or 17 minutes before total loss of control. I made the best decision I could with incomplete information and no time. That's what pilots do. The room fell silent. Then from the back someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire gallery, investigators, officials, even reporters were on their feet applauding. Jessica sat down, emotionally shattered. Present day. Jessica's therapist, Dr. Rebecca Santos, had explained it during their last session. You're experiencing acute PTSD. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the emotional withdrawal, these are normal responses to abnormal trauma. You carried an impossible burden and you're still carrying it. But everyone survived, Jessica had argued. I should be celebrating, not falling apart. Trauma doesn't care about outcomes. Your brain experienced a life-threatening event and is still processing it. The fact that you saved everyone doesn't erase what you endured up there. Jessica had stopped going to therapy after that. Talking about it made it worse. Now, watching the sun rise through her kitchen window, she felt hollowed out, empty. The airline had offered her a promotion, chief pilot for the entire fleet. She'd turned it down. They'd offered extended leave. She'd taken it but didn't know if she'd ever go back. How could she sit in a cockpit again? How could she trust that the engines wouldn't explode, that the hydraulics wouldn't fail, that she wouldn't be forced to make impossible choices with hundreds of lives in the balance? Her phone buzzed. Another message from David Chen, who'd become almost obsessively supportive. "Hey Jess, just checking in. Coffee this week." She ignored it, like she'd ignored the previous 43 messages from colleagues, friends, passengers wanting to thank her personally. The mailbox was stuffed with letters, hundreds of them. Parents of children on Flight 447 thanking her for bringing their Bobbies home. A businessman who'd made it to his daughter's wedding because of Jessica. An elderly woman who got to meet her first grandchild. Each letter was a weight, a reminder of what could have been lost. Jessica couldn't read them anymore. Emma appeared again, now dressed for school. "Mom, you're still in your pajamas. Are you sick?" "No, baby, just tired." Marcus, her 12-year-old, came down the stairs, backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked at his mother with concern too old for his age. Since the incident, both her children had become anxious, worried their mother might disappear again. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come to career day. Everyone wants to hear about the landing." Jessica felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the beginning of a panic attack. I can't, honey. Tell her I'm sorry." Disappointment flashed across Marcus's face, but he nodded. He understood, sort of. After the kids left for school, Jessica walked to the garage where she'd stashed everything from the media frenzy. Boxes of newspaper clippings, magazine covers featuring her face, printouts of social media tributes. She'd been called America's hero, the guardian angel of Flight 447, the miracle pilot. But she didn't feel like any of those things. She felt broken. Her phone rang, an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Captain Morgan, this is Major Sarah Chen, U.S. Air Force. We escorted you that day." Jessica's breath caught. She remembered the F-22s, remembered the voice that had stayed with her through the final approach. "Major Chen, thank you for being there." "I need to ask you something," Sarah said. "Would you be willing to visit Joint Base Langley? The squadron would like to meet you. No media, no ceremony, just us pilots. We'd consider it an honor." Every instinct screamed to decline, but something in Sarah's voice, a recognition, a kinship between warriors, made Jessica pause. "When?" she heard herself ask. "Whenever you're ready. We'll wait as long as it takes." Jessica looked at her trembling hands, thought about the nightmares that haunted her, considered the shell of herself she'd become. 2 weeks, she said finally. "Give me 2 weeks." She had no idea that those 2 weeks would change everything. 2 weeks later, Jessica drove through the gates of Joint Base Langley, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. She'd almost turned back 3 times during the 4-hour drive from New York. Only the promise she'd made to Major Chen kept her moving forward. The security guard checked her ID and pointed toward Hangar 7. "They're waiting for you, ma'am. And Captain Morgan, thank you for what you did." Jessica nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She parked outside the massive hangar, her heart hammering. Through the partially open doors, she could see F-22 Raptors, sleek, deadly, beautiful machines that represented the pinnacle of American air power. For a moment, she was transported back to her Air Force days, when she'd been young and fearless and certain of her place in the world. Before Flight 447 had broken her. Taking a deep breath, Jessica stepped out of her car. She'd worn her old Air Force flight jacket, the one from her C-17 days, covered in squadron patches and faded from years of use. It felt like armor against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm her. Major Sarah Chen appeared in the hangar entrance, still in her flight suit, helmet under one arm. She was smaller than Jessica had imagined, maybe 5'4", but she carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of a combat aviator. "Captain Morgan." Sarah extended her hand, and when Jessica took it, the handshake was firm between equals. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Jessica admitted. Sarah's eyes, sharp, intelligent, understanding, studied her face. "You look like hell, if you don't mind me saying." Jessica let out a surprised laugh, the first genuine one in months. "I feel like hell." "Yeah, I know that look. I wore it for 6 months after I lost my wingman in Afghanistan. Combat stress, they called it, PTSD. Whatever you want to name it, it's the weight of being responsible for lives and making impossible choices." Sarah gestured toward the hangar. "Come on, let's get you inside." Jessica followed her through the massive doors and stopped dead. The entire F-22 squadron stood at attention, 32 pilots in crisp flight suits, arranged in perfect formation. Behind them, ground crew, maintenance personnel, and support staff filled the hangar. Easily 200 people, all standing in respectful silence. "What is this?" Jessica whispered. "This," Sarah said quietly, "is recognition, real recognition. Not from the media or politicians who don't understand what you did. From us. From people who know exactly what it costs to make the calls you made up there." Sarah led Jessica to the center of the formation. An older officer, a colonel, judging by his rank insignia, stepped forward. His weathered face bore the lines of decades of military service. "Captain Morgan," the colonel's voice rang through the hangar. "I'm Colonel James Knight, commander of the 27th Fighter Squadron. We asked you here today because what you accomplished 6 months ago deserves recognition from people who truly understand it." He nodded to Sarah, who pulled out a folder and began reading. On the morning of June 15th, Captain Jessica Morgan, while commanding United Flight 447, experienced catastrophic uncontained engine failure resulting in complete hydraulic system failure, severe structural damage, and fire. With 342 souls aboard and limited flight control authority, Captain Morgan made a series of tactical decisions under extreme duress that saved every life on that aircraft. Jessica's hands trembled. She clasped them behind her back military style to hide it. Sarah continued. She chose an unconventional approach to a military airfield against standard procedures. She flew a manually controlled aircraft that simulations prove was unflyable. She executed a landing technique that violated commercial aviation protocols, but drew upon her military cargo aircraft experience. And she did all of this while maintaining command presence and composure that can only be described as extraordinary. The colonel stepped closer. "Captain Morgan, we've reviewed the cockpit voice recordings. We've studied every decision you made, and we've concluded something important." He paused, his eyes intense. "You didn't just fly an airplane that day. You fought a war against physics, against probability, against death itself. And you won." Tears burned Jessica's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "In the fighter pilot community," Colonel Knight continued, "call signs are sacred. They're earned through skill, courage, and the respect of fellow warriors. They're not given lightly, and they're rarely, almost never, given to anyone outside our community." He nodded, and 2 pilots wheeled forward a large covered object. "But after watching what you did, after witnessing the courage and skill you displayed, this squadron voted unanimously. Captain Jessica Morgan, we would like to offer you something unprecedented." The colonel pulled the cover away, and Jessica's breath stopped. It was a plaque, beautifully crafted with the F-22 Raptor Squadron emblem at the top. Below it, engraved in bold letters, "Captain Jessica Morgan. Call sign Guardian. For extraordinary airmanship and courage. Protecting 342 souls against impossible odds." June 15, 2025. Guardian, Sarah said, stepping beside her. Because that's what you were up there. Not just a pilot, but a guardian. You stood between 342 people and certain death, and you refused to let death win. Jessica's composure shattered. Tears streamed down her face as 6 months of suppressed emotion broke free. The nightmares, the guilt, the weight of those 23 minutes, it all came pouring out. But Sarah was there, and suddenly other pilots were there too, surrounding her. Not with pity, but with understanding. These were warriors who knew the burden of command, who'd faced their own impossible moments, who understood that surviving sometimes hurt worse than the battle itself. "You're not alone in this," Sarah said fiercely. "You never were. We're your squadron now. We've got your six." Captain Marcus Reed, Sarah's wingman who'd escorted Flight 447, spoke up. "I've flown combat missions over Syria. I've dodged SAMs and faced enemy fighters. But watching you bring that bird down, that was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed." Another pilot. "You saved more lives in 23 minutes than most of us will in our entire careers." Another. "You're one of us, Guardian, always will be." Jessica looked around at these faces, pilots who'd seen combat, who'd faced death, who understood the cost of courage. And for the first time since that terrible morning, she felt something shift inside her chest. She wasn't broken, she was wounded, yes, traumatized certainly, but not broken. "I still have nightmares," she whispered. "I wake up screaming. I can't get back in a cockpit. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like a fraud who got lucky." "That's normal," Colonel Manite said gently. "Trauma doesn't care that you succeeded. But you're standing here, Guardian, you survived. And with time, with support, you'll heal. We'll help you." Sarah handed Jessica the plaque. "This isn't just a piece of metal, it's a promise. You're part of this family now. When the nightmares get bad, you call us. When you doubt yourself, you remember that an entire squadron of fighter pilots looked at what you did and said, 'That's one of the best aviators we've ever seen.'" Jessica clutched the plaque to her chest, the weight of it somehow comforting. Real. She looked up at the F-22s in the hangar, their sleek forms representing excellence, skill, courage. And there, on the nearest Raptor's fuselage, freshly painted below the canopy, Guardian. Her call sign, her identity, her place among warriors. "Thank you," Jessica managed. "You have no idea what this means." "Actually," Sarah smiled, "we do. Welcome home, Guardian." The squadron erupted in applause, not polite applause, but the thunderous recognition of warriors honoring one of their own. Jessica stood there, tears streaming, but for the first time in 6 months, they weren't tears of anguish. They were tears of healing. That night back in her hotel room, Jessica slept without nightmares for the first time since Flight 447. And when Emma called to say good night, Jessica told her daughter about the call sign, about the squadron, about finding her way back. "Does this mean you're okay now, Mommy?" Emma asked. Jessica looked at the plaque sitting on the nightstand, at the word Guardian gleaming in the lamplight. "I'm getting there, baby, I'm getting there." 3 months later, Jessica Morgan returned to flying. Not commercial aviation, not yet, but as a civilian instructor at the Air Force Academy, teaching the next generation of pilots about decision-making under pressure, about courage in the face of impossible odds, about being a guardian for those who depend on you. And on her flight jacket, proudly displayed among her squadron patches, was a new addition, the 27th Fighter Squadron emblem with one word beneath it. Guardian. The pilot who'd saved 342 souls had finally saved herself. The end.